Richard never imagined his own son would one day treat him like a stranger in his own home. On Michael's 30th birthday, Richard arrived with a homemade cake and a family treasure, a pocket watch passed down from his father. He thought it would be a moment of love and memory. Instead, hidden behind the kitchen doorway, Richard heard Michael laugh with his friends, saying the best gift his father could ever give was to disappear forever. That single sentence cut deeper than any wound. When Richard stepped forward, Michael didn't deny it. He mocked his father openly, calling the cake and the watch pathetic bribes. The humiliation was complete. But instead of breaking, Richard acted. In front of everyone, he called the police, cleared the house, and watched his own son be taken away in handcuffs. During Michael's 2 weeks in jail, Richard sold the family home in Chicago, packed what mattered, and left nothing but a letter. "You said the best gift was for me to vanish, so I did." When Michael returned, strangers were living in the house. The safety net he had always relied on was gone, and for the first time in his life, he had no choice but to face the world. On his own, Richard didn't leave town to punish his son. He left to save himself. After 3 decades of giving, forgiving, and waiting for Michael to change, he finally realized love without boundaries only fuels entitlement. In a small, rented apartment near Milwaukee, Richard rebuilt his days quietly. He read books at the library, cooked simple meals, and took long walks, free from the constant weight of being treated like a wallet instead of a father. For the first time in years, peace felt possible. Michael, on the other hand, was stripped of every safety net. With nowhere to stay, he drifted into a transitional housing program. He picked up a graveyard shift at a warehouse, unloading trucks under buzzing fluorescent lights. That's where he met Don, a grizzled man in his late 50s who'd seen life chew up plenty of men and spit them back out. Don wasn't flashy, but he showed up every night, steady and dependable. Slowly, Michael began to learn from him. Richard never returned to his old role as rescuer, but he didn't turn his back completely either. He offered guidance in small, quiet ways, driving Michael to the housing office, leaving a steel thermos filled with hot coffee by his door, explaining how to stretch a paycheck instead of handing one over. These weren't handouts, they were stepping stones. Little by little, Michael started to change, saved money. He showed proof of steady employment. He even signed legal papers, giving up any claim to Richard's assets. For a man who once demanded everything, his act of surrender spoke louder than words. The real turning point came not between father and son, but across 3 generations. Over breakfast at a diner, Richard sat across from Michael and Michael's young boy Jack. The air was tense at first. Richard worried his grandson would grow up seeing the same cycle of entitlement. But then Michael surprised him. He looked his father in the eye and said, "Dad, I don't want a single dime. I just want to prove I can stand on my own." Richard nodded slowly, then placed the pocket watch on the table, not as a gift, but as a promise. "One day, Jack will earn this. It's not about money, it's about legacy." That day in the diner marked the beginning of something new. Michael kept showing up. He sent Richard short text messages, simple words like "I'm trying," and deposited small amounts into Jack's trust fund, proving his actions matched his words. Meanwhile, Richard moved west, settling in a quiet cottage along the Oregon coast. He found comfort in the steady rhythm of the waves and in knowing he had finally drawn the line between enabling and loving. He wasn't Michael's savior anymore. It was his father present, but with clear boundaries. The pocket watch stayed locked away, waiting for Jack's future. It was no longer a bribe, nor a desperate attempt to hold on. It was a simpler reminder that family isn't built on entitlement, but on showing up, on doing the work, on being accountable. Richard learned that the greatest act of love sometimes means stepping back, allowing the people you care about to stumble, fall, and eventually stand. For Michael, the absence of his father's wallet became the presence of his father's respect. And for Richard, the silence of an empty house was replaced by something far more valuable: peace, dignity, and the faint but steady hope that his son was finally becoming the man he was meant to be. Richard's new life on the Oregon coast settled into a rhythm. His mornings began with coffee on the porch, listening to gulls wheel above the gray Pacific. For the first time in years, he felt free from the noise of arguments, from the sting of being used. He had given Michael a gift greater than money. He'd given him the chance to stand on his own. But healing wasn't a straight line. Michael still stumbled. There were nights he wanted to quit the warehouse, mornings he was late for shift, moments he felt the old bitterness rise. Yet something was different now. Richard wasn't rushing in to fix it. Instead, Michael leaned on lessons from Don, the older coworker who had become both mentor and silent friend. "Life doesn't hand you do-overs," Don told him once, tightening the straps on a pallet. "You show up even when it's hard, especially then." Michael started showing up. He worked overtime, began saving enough for his own small apartment. And slowly, he reached out, not asking for help, but sharing his progress. A short text to his father, got promoted to forklift. Another, "Jack's coming over this weekend. I'm cooking dinner." Richard kept his replies brief but steady. He didn't gush. He didn't hand out praise like candy. But Michael could feel the pride behind each simple line. Good work. Keep going. The real shift came when Richard visited one Saturday and found Michael and young Jack at the kitchen table. Jack was bent over his homework while Michael cooked spaghetti, nothing fancy, but honest, warm. The apartment wasn't spotless, but it was his, paid for with sweat, not someone else's wallet. Richard realized he was looking at something he had long given up hoping for, his son becoming a father in his own right. Over coffee that night, Michael admitted what Richard had always longed to hear. "Dad, I was angry for so long. I thought you owed me. But when you disappeared, I realized you owed me nothing. Had to grow up. I'm not there yet, but I'm trying." Richard didn't lecture, simply placed his hand on the table and said, "That's all I ever wanted." The pocket watch still waited, locked away in Richard's safe deposit box, but its meaning had shifted. It was no longer a symbol of guilt or bribe. It was becoming a promise of future inheritance, not of wealth, but of responsibility. One day, Jack would receive it. Not because it was handed down carelessly, but because it was earned through character. Months rolled by. Michael kept depositing small amounts into Jack's trust, a steady drip of accountability. Richard visited often, but always left space. Their bond no longer depended on dependency, it rested on choice. Michael chose to invite his father. Richard chose to show up. For Richard, these late chapters of life no longer felt heavy with disappointment. Instead, they carried a quiet dignity. He walked the beach in the mornings, waves soaking the sand around his boots, and thought of how far they'd both come. His revenge had never been about anger. It was about drawing the line, saying enough, and reclaiming his own life. And in the silence of the sea, Richard knew this. Sometimes the only way to save your child is to stop saving them. Richard never thought he would see the day when his son valued responsibility more than comfort. But life has a way of humbling even the most stubborn hearts. The signs of change came quietly small, steady, undeniable. Michael showed Richard his pay stubs from the warehouse, proof that he wasn't just surviving, but working hard to build something of his own. For once, his words matched his actions. *1. Crisp autumn morning, Richard invited Michael to the credit union. There, under the fluorescent lights of a quiet office, he sat with a banker and established a trust for young Jack. Richard placed a portion of the money from the sale of his old house into the account. Not for Michael, but for the grandson he adored. He explained simply, "This isn't to be touched until Jack is ready. It's not for your mistakes, Michael. It's for his future." To Richard's surprise, Michael nodded without protest. A week later, Michael walked back into the same bank alone and added a modest deposit from his paycheck. It wasn't much, but it spoke volumes. At the same time, Richard gathered paperwork from his attorney. With steady hands, he watched Michael sign documents giving up any claim to the family's former home, to the trust, to anything his father owned. This wasn't a son grasping for control, it was a man finally acknowledging it wasn't his to take. Their meetings shifted from tense exchanges to quiet, respectful conversations. Sometimes over coffee, sometimes at the diner with Jack beside them scribbling in a coloring book. There was a new rhythm between them, one built on accountability rather than obligation. Asterisk the pocket watch, still locked in Richard's safe deposit box, became a symbol of that rhythm. One evening, Richard placed it on the diner table and looked at his grandson. "Jack, one day this will be yours, but not because you're my grandson, because you'll earn it the way a man earns trust and respect." Jack's eyes widened, and though he was still a boy, Richard could see the seed of understanding planting itself deep. Michael lowered his gaze, both proud and humbled. As months passed, Richard felt a new kind of peace wash over him. He packed up what little he needed and moved west to Bandon, Oregon, where the coastline stretched wide and the air smelled of salt and pine. His new home wasn't grand, just a small cottage tucked close to the beach. But it gave him exactly what he needed: quiet mornings, the sound of waves, and the knowledge that he had finally drawn the line that saved both himself and his son. Michael continued his slow climb, sending short, simple text messages that carried more weight than any apology ever could. Jack got an A in math, another deposit into the trust, still working overtime. Each note was a reminder that change, though fragile, was real. Richard understood now that his true legacy wasn't the watch, the money, or even the home he'd sold. It was the strength to say no when love had been twisted into entitlement, the wisdom to step back so his son could finally step forward. As he walked the beach at sunset, sand cold beneath his boots, Richard thought of the long road behind. Them, the betrayals, the heartbreak, the silence. Yet now there was dignity, there was hope. And above all, there was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his choice to vanish had been the very thing that allowed his son to finally appear. By the time winter settled over the Oregon coast, Richard had grown used to the rhythm of solitude. The crash of waves against the rocks, the smell of salt in the air, and the hush of pine trees in the wind gave him a peace he hadn't known in decades. Yet even in that peace, his connection to Michael remained, not through money, but through steady, deliberate choices. Michael, for the first time in his adult life, had accepted limits. Gone were the endless demands and excuses. In their place were small, consistent actions. He opened a P.O. box to keep his own records, bought a second-hand filing cabinet, and kept receipts neatly folded inside. He began sending Richard copies not because his father asked, because he wanted him to see proof. Proof that he was working, proof that he was saving, proof that he was learning to stand. Richard's attorney, Peter Alvarez, played a quiet role in this chapter. As a steady man with a calm voice, Peter helped finalize every detail of the trust fund. Together, they ensured Jack's future would remain protected no matter what storms might come. Michael signed every page without hesitation, even started adding his own deposits, small amounts, the kind most men might overlook. But for Richard, each one was a miracle. It meant Michael wasn't just saying, "I've changed," he was living it. The transformation grew clearer when Richard visited Michael's modest apartment. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched, but the atmosphere was different. Jack's drawings hung proudly on the refrigerator. A savings jar sat on the counter, half filled with crumpled bills. And Michael, once a man who mocked responsibility, now stood in an apron cooking dinner for his son. That evening, over a simple meal of pasta and garlic bread, Michael finally put words to what Richard had long waited to hear. "Dad," he said, setting his fork down, "I used to think you were abandoning me when you sold the house, but you weren't. You were saving me from myself. I get that now." Richard didn't respond right away. Just let the silence sit between them, heavy and honest. Then he nodded slowly. "That's all I ever wanted, Michael. For you to understand that love isn't a free pass. It's responsibility. It's showing up." Later that night, after Jack was asleep, Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the key too. His safe deposit box. He placed it on the table between them. "The pocket watch stays locked up until the day Jack proves himself ready. It's not for you, Michael. It's not for me. It's for him to remind him of where we came from and of the choices that changed everything." Michael's eyes filled, not with anger this time, but with gratitude. He didn't touch the key, simply whispered, "Then let's make sure he earns it." Back on the coast, Richard reflected on how far they had come. The boy who once demanded his father's disappearance was now a man learning to build. Richard, once burdened with guilt and exhaustion, now carried only dignity and quiet hope. He understood now that his greatest act of love had not been giving but withholding. By refusing to be used, he had finally allowed his son to grow. And as he walked along the shore the next morning, gulls crying above and the cold Pacific mist on his face, Richard realized that his life had come full circle. He was no longer just a father trying to save a son. He was a man at peace, who had discovered that sometimes the only way to hold on to family is to first let go. Spring brought new light to Richard's quiet cottage on the Oregon coast. By then, the sharp edges of anger had worn down, replaced by something gentler, a steady rhythm of acceptance. He no longer waited for phone calls that never came or braced for knocks at the door that meant trouble. Instead, his days were filled with books, long walks along the shore, and the quiet knowledge that the distance he'd created had finally given his son room to grow. Michael was proof of that. Once reckless and entitled, he now kept a steady. Job tracked his pay stubs and even learned to balance a budget. More than once, he showed Richard the small columns he'd scribbled in a notebook: income, expenses, and savings. For a man who once lived on excuses, this small act was almost revolutionary. But Richard's proudest moment came when Michael asked him to ride along to the bank. Sitting across the desk from the teller, Michael slid a few folded bills across the counter. "Deposit into Jack's trust, please," he said with a quiet certainty. It wasn't much, hardly enough to impress anyone. Yet to Richard, it was the clearest sign his son was finally investing in something beyond himself. Richard, too, was making moves quietly in the background. He opened a P.O. box to separate his mail, arranged his papers neatly into files, and stayed in steady contact with Anna, the caretaker of a small property tied to Helen's past. With the help of attorney Peter Alvarez, he drew up cessation letters to shield himself from old claims and potential manipulation. For the first time in years, he felt protected not just legally but emotionally. One evening, Richard sat at his kitchen table, pen in hand, dividing his life into 3 columns: what they know, what they don't, what I want. Them to think it wasn't about secrecy, it was about clarity. He refused to let confusion or manipulation creep back into his life. This time, he would stay one step ahead. The test came sooner than expected. Michael and his sister Laura appeared one afternoon with their lawyer, hoping to discuss the future. In years past, Richard might have folded under their pressure, anxious to keep the peace. But now, he met them with steady eyes and a firm voice. "This house, this life, it's mine. I'm not here to be managed or stripped down, like an asset. If you want to talk, we do it on my terms." The meeting ended quickly, their lawyer leaving empty-handed, Michael subdued but not combative. Laura's sharp words rolled off Richard like rain on stone. Back at the cottage, Richard gathered a box of belongings that once belonged to each child. He hired movers to deliver them with simple notes: returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me. There was no anger in the gesture, only clarity. Boundaries finally set in stone. Michael was the first to confront him. "You're selfish," he spat, anger flashing in his eyes. But Richard no longer trembled. He stood calmly, hand on the doorknob, and replied, "No, I'm free. And you will be too if you learn to stand without me." Then he closed the door. That night, Richard didn't feel guilt. He felt a release. For the first time in decades, his life was his own. And though the future still held uncertainty, one thing was clear: he would never again sacrifice his peace for someone else's entitlement. The cottage on the Oregon coast had become Richard's sanctuary. But peace never meant isolation. Though his life was quieter now, connections still found their way to him, sometimes in unexpected forms. A thick envelope arrived one morning from Lisbon, Portugal. Inside were carefully stamped documents confirming what Richard had only recently begun to accept: the villa Helen had quietly purchased years before now belonged fully to him. Her foresight, hidden away in blue folders, was finally taking shape as protection against the very storms she had predicted. Along with the deed were letters from attorney Peter Alvarez outlining steps to shield the villa from any challenge. Richard felt a swell of gratitude toward his late wife. She had seen what he couldn't, and she had built a safety net, not of money, but of freedom. Inspired, Chart began sorting through his own belongings with a sharper eye. In the small cottage piles formed boxes labeled Go, Stay, Travel. He wasn't preparing to leave just yet, but he wanted his affairs in order. Too many years had been spent in confusion, letting others dictate his path. Now, clarity was his compass. When movers hauled away to large boxes, each filled with items that once belonged to his children, Richard included a note in his neat handwriting, returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me. He didn't expect gratitude, and none came. But the silence that followed was louder than any argument. It meant there was nothing left to contest. Michael, of course, struggled most. He showed up at Richard's door, eyes burning with anger. "You're selfish, Dad. You've cut us out of everything." Richard stayed calm, leaning against the frame of his door. "No, Michael. I've cut out the part of my life where I was treated like a bank account. You wanted me gone, remember? I listened, and now I'm living." For the first time, Michael didn't push back. He left in silence, shoulders tense, but his anger rang hollow. Days later, a thinner envelope arrived from Lisbon. Confirmation of bank transfers, notarized seals, and most importantly, a letter from Peter Alvarez that began, "Your ownership is fully protected under Portuguese law." Richard slid the documents into his desk drawer, then closed it with a decisive hand. A chapter was ending. In the weeks that followed, Richard moved through his cottage with a sense of lightness. The furniture no longer carried arguments. Photographs no longer reminded him of betrayal. Everything felt stripped down to essentials. What mattered stayed. What didn't was gone. That Sunday, he invited Michael for coffee. The air between them was cautious but calmer. Richard spoke plainly. "I'm not erasing you, son. I'm erasing the old patterns. If you want to be in my life, it has to be as a man, not as a dependent." Michael swallowed hard, then nodded. His voice was rough. "I get it, and I'm trying." Richard believed him not because of the words, but because of the actions. He had begun to see the pay stubs, the deposits into Jack's trust, the way he kept showing up at work even when it wore him down. These weren't empty promises. They were proof. As Richard locked his safe deposit box later that week, the weight of the old pocket watch in his hand felt different. It was no longer a burden of guilt or a desperate gift. It was a promise, waiting quietly for the right hands to claim it. And as the Oregon waves pounded the shore outside his window, Richard knew this truth. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with anger, but with boundaries. And sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't wealth, but the lesson that love must be rooted in respect. The Oregon coast had given Richard a new rhythm, but his life was not meant to be lived in solitude. Family ties, fragile as they were, still called him forward. And in the months after returning his children's belongings, Richard found himself taking one more step toward rebuilding, not with grand gestures, but with quiet clarity. A package of documents from Lisbon confirmed what he already knew. The villa was his, free and clear. Holding the embossed papers, Richard felt Helen's presence more strongly than ever. She had foreseen the storm of greed and confusion, and she had left behind a map to freedom. It was her way of whispering, "Stand tall, Richard. Protect what's yours." And so he did. He spent afternoons sorting through every drawer, every box. He labeled things go, stay, travel. Photographs of family vacations went into a chest he would keep. Old tools Michael had once borrowed without returning went into a box marked with his name. Laura's childhood trinkets went into another. When the movers arrived, Richard gave them simple instructions. Deliver the boxes to his children with a short note returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me. The reaction was exactly what he expected. Silence from Laura, anger from Michael. His son stormed to his door one evening, red-faced, shouting, "You're selfish. You've abandoned us." But Richard stood calmly. In the doorway, hands steady. "No, Michael. I haven't abandoned you. I've stopped abandoning myself." Then he closed the door, not with bitterness, but with finality. Meanwhile, he was making quiet preparations for the future. The Lisbon law firm confirmed his inheritance of the villa. The deed, the bank records, and the correspondence were all filed neatly away. He opened a P.O. box for sensitive mail, arranged insurance for the villa, and even booked a refundable one-way ticket to Portugal. He wasn't sure if he'd use it yet, but the option gave him comfort. Richard also hired movers to clear out the last of his children's things from storage. With each box that left his home, he felt lighter, freer. The house no longer carried the weight of disputes or the echoes of betrayal. It was his now, fully and without compromise. One evening, he sat down with pen and paper and divided his world into 3 columns. What they know, what they don't. What I want them to think, the act was not about secrecy, it was about control. About refusing to let his life slip back into the chaos of manipulation. For the first time, he was not reacting to his children's demands. He was planning for himself. The final gesture of this chapter came with quiet strength. He mailed each child their belongings with notes clipped neatly to the top. "This belongs to you. This no longer belongs to me. What is mine, I will keep. No more guilt, no more debate." The message was clear. His boundaries were not up for discussion. When Michael tried one last time to confront him, Richard's answer was simple. "I am not a resource. I am a man. If you want a relationship, it will be as equals, not as a master and servant." That night, Richard closed his front door and felt something shift deep within him. The fear was gone. The guilt was gone. Remained was a kind of freedom that had taken him decades to find. As the waves rolled onto the Oregon shore outside his window, Richard realized he had finally taken back his life. The inheritance of bitterness had been broken. What remained was dignity, peace, and the chance to pass on something far greater to his grandson, a legacy of strength, not surrender. The storm between father and son had not ended. It had simply gone quiet. Weeks passed after Richard mailed the boxes of belongings, and for a time he wondered if Michael would finally walk away for good. But anger has a way of circling back, especially when pride is bruised. One evening, Richard heard the sharp rap of a fist against his door. He opened it to find Michael, face tight with resentment. "You've ruined everything," he spat. "You're selfish. You don't care about your family. All you ever think about is yourself." Years ago, such words would have gutted Richard. He would have scrambled to defend himself, to explain, to appease. But not now. He had walked too far, learned too much. His voice was calm, almost gentle. He said, "What you call selfishness is what I call survival. I gave and gave until there was nothing left of me. I won't do it anymore." Michael's jaw tightened. But there was no fight in his eyes this time, only frustration. He muttered a curse under his breath and stormed away. Richard didn't follow. He closed the door softly, not in anger, but with finality, and stood in the quiet cottage with a strange sense of peace. Later that week, Richard received the final set of Lisbon documents. The ink on the pages was fresh, the stamps official. He was the sole legal owner of Helen's villa. No one could touch it, not Michael, not Laura, not anyone. Sliding the papers into his desk drawer, Richard exhaled deeply. The weight of uncertainty was gone. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, under the glow of a single lamp. Around him were 3 neat piles of belongings. One marked go, one marked stay, and one marked travel. The travel pile was the smallest. A few important files, his passport, and Helen's letter. He traced her handwriting with his finger, feeling her presence. She had known their children might one day turn against him. She had left him not just property, but a plan. The next morning, Richard contacted a moving service. He had the rest of his children's items shipped directly to them, each with a note clipped to the top, returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me. No anger, no explanation, just clarity. When Michael came again this time, red with fury, Richard was ready. The son shouted, called him ungrateful, demanded explanations. Richard let him finish, then answered with quiet conviction. "You asked me once to disappear? So I did. But what I found when I left was strength. You may call it selfish. I call it finally being free." Michael stared at him, stunned by the calmness. For a long moment neither spoke. Then, with a frustrated shake of his head, Michael turned and walked away. As the door clicked shut, Richard leaned against the frame and let the silence settle. He felt no guilt, no fear, no regret. Just peace. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the Oregon coast, Richard walked the beach, the tide tugging at the sand beneath his boots. He thought of Helen, of the years he had spent sacrificing, of the pain of betrayal, but he also thought of Jack, his grandson, the one bright light that still tied 3 generations together. For him, Richard would endure. For him, he would protect the legacy Helen had left behind. Richard smiled faintly at the horizon. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living on his own terms, with dignity intact and hope still alive. And for the first time in decades, he felt truly untouchable. Richard sat alone in the quiet of his Oregon cottage, the ocean winds pressing softly against the windows. It had been weeks since he had sold the family home in Chicago and left behind the chaos of demands, accusations, and betrayals. At first, the silence felt heavy, almost unbearable. But slowly, it began to change into something else: freedom. For years, his children, Michael and Laura, had treated him like a resource instead of a father. They saw his home, his savings, and even his time as assets to be divided, managed, and controlled. But now, all of that was gone. The house they once schemed over belonged to strangers. The endless debates over the future were no longer his burden. Richard had made his choice. He had given himself the gift of peace. Still, part of him worried about Michael. His son had been the loudest in pushing him to disappear, the one who mocked him most openly. Yet now, without the safety net of his father's money and home, Michael had no choice but to face the world head-on. Richard started receiving small signs of change. A short message one week. "Dad, I found work at the warehouse." Another a few days later. "Jack's with me this weekend. We're cooking dinner." They weren't apologies, not exactly, but they were something better proof that Michael was starting to grow into responsibility. Then came the day Richard stopped by Michael's apartment. What he found surprised him. The place was modest, even rough around the edges, but it was Michael's. Jack was at the table working on homework, and Michael stood at the stove, stirring a pot of spaghetti. Richard sat down quietly, watching. For the first time, he saw his son not as the entitled young man who had once demanded everything, but as a father. Learning, stumbling, and trying. Over dinner, Michael admitted the truth Richard had longed to hear. "I thought you abandoned me, Dad. But now I see you weren't abandoning me. You were forcing me to grow up. I hated you for it, but now I get it." Richard didn't lecture. He didn't gloat. He simply put his hand on the table and said, "That's all I ever wanted, son. For you to stand on your own 2 feet." Later that evening, as Richard drove back to the coast, he realized how far they both had come. The pain, the betrayal, the harsh words, they were scars now, not open wounds. And though nothing could erase the past, something new was being built. Respect. Weeks later, Michael added his first deposit to Jack's trust fund. It wasn't large, but it was steady. When he showed Richard the receipt, Richard felt something he hadn't in years: pride. It's not the pride of giving or rescuing, but the pride of watching his son finally carry his own weight. As Richard walked along the beach that night, the waves rolling cold and steady against the sand, he thought about Helen. She had always known this day might come. She had left him the tools, the property, and the wisdom to protect himself. But more importantly, she had given him courage. The courage to say no, the courage to walk away, and the courage to let his son face life without a crutch. In that moment, Richard understood the deeper lesson. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't giving more, it's stepping back and letting someone earn their way. There comes a time when love must draw boundaries. True love is not endless sacrifice. It's teaching responsibility even when it hurts. Sometimes, stepping back is the only way to help those we love step forward. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone you love? How did it change your relationship? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories, and ring the bell so you never miss a new chapter. Together, we can remind the world that dignity, respect, and love always belong hand in hand.